On August 5th, 1976, legendary rock musician Eric Clapton was performing a concert in Birmingham, England, and erupted into a pretty much racist tirade. He shouted, "Stop Britain from becoming a black colony. Get the foreigners out." He addressed the audience and said, "Do we have any foreigners in the audience tonight? If so, please put up your hands. So, where are you? Well, wherever you are, I think you should all just leave. Not just leave the hall. Leave our country. I don't want you here. In the room or in my country."
Eric Clapton's done a concert in Birmingham where he said he supports Enoch Powell. He thinks the WOG should get out.
The unfortunate fact was that Clapton wasn't alone in these comments, and someone needed to stand up for what was commonplace in the UK at the time, and thus, the inspirational Rock Against Racism movement was born. Eric Clapton has since apologized for these comments, and during this time, this racist rhetoric could be heard all over the UK. This climate of racism broadly resulted from two things. Firstly, the UK government had invited a lot of immigrants from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent after World War II in the hopes of rebuilding the country. And secondly, the tough economic conditions meant that many British people were struggling financially, and immigrants were used as a scapegoat for these problems. During Eric Clapton's speech, he referenced Enoch Powell, a conservative politician known for his views on immigration. In his famous Rivers of Blood speech, he said, "The post-war's influx of immigrants from the former colonies in the West Indies, Southeast Asia, and Africa made the native English, quote, strangers in their own land." Racism was so commonplace that people of these nations were regularly beaten up just because of their race. The British filmmaker Gurinder Chadha came from an Indian family who owned a convenience store and basically lived in fear. She said, "Being in a shop, we were very vulnerable because the next person who walked in could beat you up." A political party known as the National Front was gaining traction in white working class areas and was not distancing itself from the violence that was happening either, as this article from The Guardian would explain. The National Front had won 40% of the votes in the spring elections in Blackburn. 1 month earlier, an Asian teenager, Gurdeep Singh Chaggar, had been murdered by a gang of white youths in Southall. One down, a million ago, was the response to the killing from John Kingsley Reid of the National Front. For many young people at the time, the comments by Eric Clapton were the straw that broke the camel's back, and it was something that motivated a group of white political activists to actively stand up to the racism that was unfolding. Red Saunders, Roger Huddle, Joe Reiford, Pete Bruno, and others were part of a theater group called Cartoon Clowns. They decided to start a group known as Rock Against Racism, which loosely stood for fans of rock music who were anti-racist. With the lack of social media at the time, it was very difficult to get their message out there. Their first move was to write to the letters to the editor section of music magazines, where they would call out Eric Clapton. The letter opened with, "When I read about Eric Clapton's Birmingham concert when he urged support for Enoch Powell, I nearly
puked. What's going on, Eric? You've got a touch of brain damage, mate."
The letter then points out that Clapton's a rock musician, and his whole career comes from what was originally black music. It reads, "Own up. Half your music is black. You're rock music's biggest
colonialist. You're a good musician, but where would you be without the blues and R&B?
And the big irony is that before Clapton's Rant, he had a #1 hit with "I Shot the Sheriff," a cover of a Bob Marley song. The letter closed with, "Who shot the sheriff, Eric?"
Sure as hell wasn't you, mate.
At the bottom of the letter, they provided an address and asked readers to write to them if they were interested in the Rock Against Racism movement. To their shock and surprise, they realized that they weren't alone in their views. They received 600 letters. Their next step was to host a Rock Against Racism gig, which was later abbreviated to RAR. Rock, during this time, was a predominantly white genre of music, so it seemed nonsensical to just have white rock groups playing. As well as the thriving rock music scene happening in the UK during this time, reggae music was also booming. According to Ruth Gregory, who became a member of RAR, she said, "Many of the musicians were the children of people who came over from the Caribbean in the 1950s, so they applied reggae to the British situation, and in some ways, that was quite a similar take on the situation of punk." The first Rock Against Racism took place in the Princess Alice pub in Forest Gate in London's East End, and featured the white singer Carol Grimes alongside the reggae group Matumbi. Music was a lot more tribal back then, so having two completely different genres of music playing at one concert was a big deal, and a political statement in itself. Carol and Matumbi joined each other on stage at the end, and this would become a hallmark of their future gigs. Sid Shelton, a photographer and member of Rock Against Racism, said, "We didn't try to make things change by shouting slogans from the stage. The example itself was a political act. People aren't born racist and can change." At the same time, they were aware of the people they were up against. At every gig, people volunteered to work as extra security in case something kicked off. As well as the gigs, they also released a magazine called Temporary Hoarding, where they could promote the gigs and musicians associated with the movement. The magazine also encouraged people to start their own Rock Against Racism gigs too. The first page had their manifesto, which read, "We want rebel music, street music, music that breaks down people's fear of one another, crisis music, now music, music that knows who the real enemy is, rock against racism, love music, hate racism." Eric Clapton was a musician who became prominent in the 60s, and by this stage, in the 1970s, the most popular subgenre of rock music. But this music had problems of its own. Bands like the Sex Pistols and Siouxsie and the Banshees wore swastikas on their clothing, but these were used purely for their shock value and not something that they necessarily supported. However, a lot of actual people that followed that didn't see it that way and saw it as an affirmation of their beliefs. A lot of their audience were, quote, skinheads, a subculture known for their shaved heads and often shared these beliefs.
Our country free from invasion when the invaders have got black, brown, and yellow faces.
A punk group called Sham 69 came to realize that a large group of their fan base were racist, to the extent that their fans would make salutes during their concerts, and their singer Jimmy Percy was criticized for not calling them out enough. So Sham 69 decided to nail their colors to the mast by headlining a Rock Against Racism gig. They played alongside the reggae group Misty and Roots, whose manager had once been beaten into a coma during an anti-racist demonstration. Speaking about the gig, Sid Shelton said, "We've gotten word that the National Front skinheads were going to infiltrate and trash the gig. Misty organized a posse of really serious and quite heavily tooled up guys to line the stage. They did get into the building, but they never got anywhere near that stage because we had it so well protected." Jimmy Percy and Sham 69 did have a fairly large following of right-wing young lads, which they tried to shake off. As time went on, Rock Against Racism joined forces with the Anti-Nazi League, who, as the name suggests, were another anti-racist group, but had a lot more money. With the support of the Anti-Nazi League, they decided that instead of having small gigs, they could have their own summer carnival. This would make the biggest statement possible and hopefully attract thousands of people. The plan was as follows. They would start at Trafalgar Square, which is the starting point for many protests in London to this day. Then they would march from the center of London and through the National Front's voting base in the East End, culminating in a massive concert in Victoria Park. Rock Against Racism member Roger Huddle said, "We wanted to give people space to stand against them. It was not about the individuals, but organizations helping to set it up. We played it by ear. There was nothing corporate about organizing the first carnival. We had sympathetic stage builders and volunteer guards. We wanted the carnival in the East End of London, the heart of the working class where the National Front were trying to build a following." Before this event started, they were alerted of the possible danger that lay ahead. Sham 69 had agreed to perform, but suddenly had second thoughts and decided to pull out. Their reason for doing this was because Jimmy Percy was now receiving death threats. On April 30th, 1978, the protest was about to begin. The organizers anticipated 10,000 people to join them, but that was not the figure that arrived that day. Instead, 100,000 people came to the march. From Trafalgar Square, they walked towards Fleet Street, a street where most of the newspapers were based, and the protesters chanted outside the offices of the Daily Express, a newspaper which was complacent with whipping up racial hatred. Bernadette McGough, who was on the march when she was 16 years old, said, "There was a bit of scuffling with the police outside various establishments. A lot of it was aimed at the press. There were skinheads along the way, a lot of chanting, there was Sieg Heiling and all that. These days I'd be a bit more nervous about it, but it was the right thing to do. We weren't looking for trouble, but if it came along, people were ready." They walked further and further through central London and were about to approach Liverpool Street, and from here on in, they were in the East End of London, where an attack was much more likely. The singer Billy Bragg, who was in the crowd at the time, said, "Once that we got out onto Liverpool Street and got out onto the East End proper, there were a few places where it was expected that the National Front might be waiting for us. The police escorted us all the way through. Eventually, they walked by a pub in Bethnal Green, where an old man outside a pub waved a salute towards them, a Nazi salute. Bragg said that the man was, quote, trying to hold back this huge tide of multiculturalism that was seething by and realizing that, it's over for him. Because they were all marching at the same time, the people performing at Victoria Park had no idea what was happening. The group X-Ray Specs were performing in front of an almost empty crowd. They initially had a crowd of 3 or 4 people, but within a matter of minutes, they were playing in front of 80,000. The British filmmaker Gurinder Chadha, who I mentioned at the beginning, was at this concert and said, "It was an incredibly emotional moment because, for the first time, I felt surrounded by people on my side. That was when I thought that something had changed in Britain forever. Before Rock Against Racism, there was no sense that it wasn't okay to be racist. But with RAR, we got to see that there were others willing to speak out against it and talk about a different kind of Britain." The punk group The Clash headlined the gig alongside the reggae group Steel Pulse, as well as other groups such as Tom Robinson Band, X-Ray Specs, and Patrick Fitzgerald. This defining moment was when The Clash was about to start a song, and suddenly, emerging from the back room was Jimmy Percy, who had ignored the death threats and decided to perform on stage anyway. Together with The Clash, they sang the song White Riot, which is a song about encouraging white people to protest in solidarity with the Black and South Asian people that had been rioting at the time. Rock Against Racism continued as a movement, but this event in Victoria Park was their finest hour. Although it would be naive to think that this solved the problem and that racism wasn't an issue in the UK any longer, it definitely did make a difference. Polly Styrene, the lead singer of X-Ray Specs, who was also mixed, said, "Has RAR achieved anything? I think it's achieved a lot. I think racism isn't so blatant as it was in the 70s, when it was socially acceptable to call people all kinds of names because of their different backgrounds. I can't speak for other artists, but for me, RAR was something that made me think about other people's lives and struggles. At the time, you only had to watch sitcoms to be aware of racism, and I was attacked a couple of times as a child because I had an olive complexion." Rubika Shah was the director of the 2019 documentary White Riot, which told the story of Rock Against Racism. When asked about what her hopes were for people who watched the film, she said, "I hope they feel inspired and make the connection with what's happening today, politically and all around the world. The late 70s was over 40 years ago, but much of the politics feels very close to home, especially the anti-immigration stance and racist sloganeering." Michaeli Riley, the guitarist from the group Steel Pulse, is now Dr. Michaeli Riley and is a lecturer on black music at the University of Westminster. He was asked about that moment at Victoria Park and how it relates to today. He said, "There was an excitement that it was turning into something really special because more and more people kept coming into the park. Most of the people involved with Rock Against Racism are still around, but now they're in senior or middle management positions or running institutions, and their children would quite likely be at BLM protests." Make sure to subscribe for more.